You told me to know my place, Officer Holloway. Judge Malcolm Hayes spoke with such measured calm that the entire federal courtroom seemed to pause around him. On the polished oak bench rested the security credential Grant Holloway had worn with absolute confidence less than 20 minutes earlier. Now the white court security officer stood alone near the center aisle, his radio removed, his certainty gone, and every face in the room turned toward him. Attorneys had stopped arranging their files. Reporters held their pens above unfinished sentences. Court Clerk Amanda Lewis sat motionless beneath the federal seal, while Chief Deputy United States Marshal Robert King watched from beside the bench. Malcolm adjusted the sleeve of his black judicial robe and looked directly at the officer who had decided, without evidence, where a black man belonged. "This court is not here to embarrass you," he continued. "It is here to examine what happens when authority stops listening to the truth." Holloway tried to answer, but no words came. He had expected anger. He had expected retaliation. Instead, he faced something far more powerful: witnesses, official records, security footage, and the consequences of his own choices. Malcolm placed one hand beside the credential. "You believe this card gave you the right to define another person's place," he said. "Now the record will show how you used that responsibility." The courtroom remained silent. Not one person defended Holloway. The people inside had turned against him before they learned Malcolm's title, because they had watched him reject proof again and again. Less than 20 minutes earlier, the same courthouse had looked ordinary beneath a cold Baltimore rain. Water moved in thin lines down the tall windows, while tires whispered across the wet streets outside. Inside, security scanners hummed near the entrance. Lawyers carried thick folders beneath their arms. Families waited on wooden benches under harsh lights, hoping the system would finally hear them. Malcolm entered through the public doors wearing a charcoal suit, a navy tie, and a dark overcoat marked with drops of rain. There was no driver waiting behind him, no escort walking beside him, and no judicial robe announcing who he was. He had spent most of the night at a hospital about 2 miles away, sitting beside his mother after a brief medical concern. Rather than return home, he had gone directly to the courthouse with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and an old leather briefcase in the other. Inside that briefcase were confidential materials concerning black residents who claimed a former city officer had repeatedly ignored identification, dismissed explanations, and treated suspicion as proof. Malcolm had reviewed the documents before sunrise. One name appeared more than once: Grant Holloway. Near the restricted entrance to judicial chambers, Malcolm reached into his coat for his key card. Before he could remove it, a firm voice stopped him. "That hallway is not open to the public." Malcolm turned. Holloway stood about 10 feet away in a courthouse security uniform, one hand near his radio and judgment already settled across his face. Malcolm offered a polite nod. "I am aware." Holloway stepped closer, then moved away from the door. Malcolm studied the nameplate above the officer's credential. Recognition passed quietly through his eyes. Then he removed his federal identification and held it forward. "You may verify this with the clerk's office." Holloway barely looked at it before handing it back. "I have seen fake identification before." Malcolm returned the card to his pocket. "Then follow the verification procedure." Holloway's jaw tightened. "You do not give instructions here." Malcolm remained still as rain tapped against the windows. "Then contact someone who does." Holloway did not reach for his radio. Instead, he looked at Malcolm as though the request itself were a challenge to his authority. The officer had been given a federal identification card, a full name, and a clear way to verify both. Yet he seemed more interested in defending his first assumption than discovering the truth. "I decide when verification is necessary," he said. Malcolm held his gaze. "That is not how federal security procedure works." A few feet away, Court Clerk Amanda Lewis stepped out of the records office carrying 2 folders against her chest. She recognized Malcolm immediately and slowed when she saw Holloway blocking the entrance to chambers. "Good morning, Judge Hayes," she began, but Holloway raised one hand before she could finish. "Stay back, ma'am. I am handling a security concern." Amanda looked from Holloway to Malcolm. "There is no security concern. He has authorized access." Holloway turned toward her with visible irritation. "Did you personally inspect his identification?" "I do not need to. I know who he is." "That is not an answer." Malcolm noticed the pattern immediately. Holloway was not asking questions to gather facts. He was asking them to reject every fact that challenged the conclusion he had already chosen. Amanda stepped closer. "Officer Holloway, contact Chief Deputy King. He will confirm everything." Holloway gave a short, dismissive laugh. "I am not calling a chief deputy every time someone claims to belong behind a restricted door." Malcolm reached slowly into his coat and removed his key card. The federal seal caught the harsh hallway light. "Then watch carefully," he said. He placed the card against the electronic reader beside the chamber's entrance. A green light appeared, followed by the quiet click of the lock releasing. Amanda exhaled, certain the matter had ended. It had not. Holloway moved between Malcolm and the open doorway. That card could have been stolen. The words left the hallway colder than the rain outside. Two attorneys walking toward Courtroom 4 stopped near the elevators. A court reporter lowered her coffee cup. The people nearby did not yet understand Malcolm's position, but they understood what they had just seen. Proof had been offered. Holloway had rejected it because accepting it would require admitting that his judgment had been wrong. Malcolm slipped the key card back into his pocket. "You have now refused 3 forms of verification," he said. "My identification, the clerk's confirmation, and authorized electronic access." Holloway's jaw tightened. "Do not lecture me about my job. I am describing your choices." The officer glanced toward the growing audience, and embarrassment sharpened his expression. He reached for his radio at last, but his report did not mention the valid card, the working access key, or Amanda's confirmation. "I have a suspicious individual attempting to enter judicial chambers with questionable credentials," he said. Malcolm listened without interrupting. Every missing detail mattered. Every carefully selected word shaped a version of events designed to justify a conclusion Holloway had reached before speaking to him. When the transmission ended, Malcolm lifted the leather briefcase slightly. "This contains confidential court material. You are not authorized to open or remove it." Holloway looked at the case, then back at Malcolm. "Set it down." "No," the answer was quiet. "Immediate." Holloway stepped closer, lowering his voice. "People like you walk into places like this and think the rules do not apply." Amanda's face went still. One attorney near the elevator opened a notebook. Malcolm felt the weight of the confidential materials in his hand and understood that the conduct described in those documents was now unfolding directly in front of him. "Officer Holloway," he said, "you should think very carefully about what you say next." Holloway heard the warning, but he did not hear the opportunity inside it. Malcolm was not threatening him. He was giving him one final chance to return to procedure before pride carried the moment beyond repair. Yet Holloway glanced toward the attorneys, the court reporter, and Amanda Lewis, and saw only witnesses to a challenge he believed he had to win. "I know exactly what I am saying," he replied. His voice rose just enough to reach the open doors of Courtroom 4. "You are refusing a lawful security instruction." Malcolm remained calm. "State the instruction and the rules supporting it." Holloway paused. The question was simple, which made it dangerous. He had no rule to cite because Malcolm had shown valid identification, demonstrated authorized access, and received confirmation from a court employee. What remained was not security. It was Holloway's need to prove that his first judgment could not be questioned. "The rule is that you follow an officer's directions," he said. One of the attorneys near. The elevator stopped writing and looked up. Amanda tightened her grip on the folders. Malcolm studied Holloway with the patience of a judge listening to testimony that revealed more than the speaker intended. "Authority is not a rule," Malcolm said. "It is a responsibility." Holloway's expression hardened. "Do not try to impress me with speeches. I am asking you to explain your actions. I do not answer to you." The words echoed beneath the high ceiling. For a moment, no one moved. Imagine standing in a federal courthouse with proof in your pocket, access at your fingertips, and a clerk ready to confirm your identity, only to realize that none of it matters to a man who has already decided what your face means. Malcolm had read that experience in complaint after complaint. A driver who presented a valid registration and was still treated as suspicious. A teacher whose employee badge was dismissed without inspection. A college student whose explanation was described as an attitude problem. Their words had been reduced to summaries, then closed for lack of corroboration. Now Malcolm understood the pattern not as language on a page, but as something unfolding in the space between Holloway's certainty and the truth. Amanda stepped forward again. "Officer Holloway, Judge Hayes is scheduled in Courtroom 4 at 10 o'clock. Holloway turned toward her before she could continue. I told you to stay out of this. The title had been spoken, but he rejected it as quickly as every other fact. You expect me to believe that? He asked. Amanda stared at him. You could confirm it in less than 30 seconds. Holloway pointed toward the courtroom doors. He can wait inside until support arrives. Malcolm glanced at the clock above the entrance. 9:46. 14 minutes remained before the scheduled hearing. We're inside, he asked. Holloway motioned toward the rear section near the defense tables. There. The attorneys exchanged looks. The court reporter set down her coffee. Amanda's face lost its uncertainty and became firm. That area is reserved for defendants and counsel. Holloway did not look at her. Then he should have no problem waiting there. Malcolm held Holloway's gaze. You have been given my identification, my access card, the clerk's confirmation, and my name. What exactly are you still investigating? Holloway stepped aside and pointed into the courtroom. Whether you understand that people like you do not decide where they belong. The hallway went silent. Not cautious silence. Not confused silence. This was the silence that follows a line everyone recognizes should never have been crossed. Malcolm looked toward the empty judicial bench, then back at Holloway. People like me? He asked. Holloway's confidence returned when he mistook restraint for surrender. You heard me. Malcolm lifted his briefcase and walked toward courtroom 4. The people watching moved aside, but their eyes remained on Holloway. The officer followed, believing he had taken control. He did not realize the courtroom was already beginning to turn against him. Inside courtroom 4, the air carried the quiet pressure of a room waiting for judgment. Attorneys stood beside carefully arranged exhibits. Reporters occupied the rear benches with notebooks open across their laps. Several families sat beneath the federal seal, holding folders filled with dates, names, and questions that had waited too long for answers. Malcolm entered without speaking and walked toward the section Holloway had indicated. Every step across the polished floor seemed louder than it should have been. Holloway followed several feet behind, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed obedience had confirmed his authority. Sit there, he said, pointing toward a chair near the defense tables. Malcolm placed his leather briefcase beside the chair, but remained standing. Before I sit, answer one question. Holloway folded his arms. You are not in a position to question me. Malcolm looked directly at him. Where exactly do you believe my place is? The words traveled through the courtroom and drew every eye toward the aisle. Holloway glanced at the growing audience, then pointed again. Right there, until someone proves you belong somewhere else. No one laughed. Pens stopped moving. Even the court reporter paused above her keys. Amanda Lewis entered behind them and moved toward the clerk's desk. Officer Holloway, this has gone far enough. He turned toward her. Return to your station. My station is here, she replied. Her voice was steady now. And I have already confirmed that he has authorized access. Holloway looked toward the attorneys as though expecting one of them to support him. Instead, a public defender named Daniel Mercer closed his case file and stepped into the aisle. He was known for speaking carefully, and when he did, people listened. Officer, you have been shown identification, electronic access, and confirmation from a court employee. What legal basis do you have for continuing this? Holloway's expression tightened. This is a security matter. Then follow the security procedure, Daniel said. Another voice came from the gallery. An older black veteran named Charles Whitaker rose slowly with the help of his cane. Procedure is supposed to protect everyone, he said. Not only the people you already trust. Holloway turned toward him. Sir, sit down. Charles remained standing. I served this country for 26 years. I know the difference between maintaining order and denying someone dignity. A low murmur moved through the gallery. Malcolm watched the room carefully. The people around him still did not know the full truth, but they no longer needed it. They had seen valid identification dismissed. They had watched a working keycard ignored. They had heard Amanda's confirmation rejected and the phrase people like you spoken without hesitation. The courtroom was not turning because Malcolm held hidden authority. It was turning because Holloway's conduct had become impossible to defend. Amanda opened the official court log. The time is 9:49, she said clearly. I am recording that Officer Grant Holloway refused multiple forms of verification and directed an authorized court official toward the defense section. Holloway stared at her. Do not put that in the record. Amanda looked up. You do not control the record. The sentence landed harder than a raised voice. Daniel began writing down every exchange. The court reporter resumed typing. Charles remained, standing beside the gallery rail. One by one, the witnesses stopped being spectators. Holloway saw the change and mistook it for rebellion. Everyone needs to sit down and stop interfering, he ordered. No one moved. Malcolm finally lowered himself into the chair, not because Holloway had earned compliance, but because the truth was now gathering around him. He rested one hand on the briefcase and looked toward the empty judicial bench. Officer Holloway, he said, you decided where I belonged before you knew anything about me. Holloway stepped closer. I know enough. Malcolm turned his gaze back to him. That is exactly the problem. For several seconds, Holloway said nothing. The ventilation system became the loudest sound in Courtroom 4, and every person present seemed to wait for him to recognize the line he had crossed. Instead, he looked around the room and saw only people challenging the version of authority he believed belonged to him alone. This is still a security investigation, he said, though the words no longer carried the same certainty. Daniel Mercer closed his notebook, then explained the security threat. Holloway ignored him and turned toward Malcolm. Open the briefcase. Malcolm remained seated. No, you are refusing a direct order. I am protecting confidential federal material. Holloway looked at the worn leather case beside Malcolm's chair. A small metal plate near the handle bore the seal of the United States District Court and the engraved words, "The Honorable Malcolm Hayes." Amanda saw Holloway reading it. The court identification is clearly marked, she said. Holloway's eyes remained on the plate for a moment, but accepting what it showed would have required him to admit that every decision he had made since the hallway was built on an assumption rather than evidence. A plate can be copied, he replied. Daniel stared at him. Charles Whitaker slowly shook his head. The court reporter paused again, not from confusion, but disbelief. Malcolm understood that the situation was no longer a mistake. A mistake changes when facts appear. Holloway had seen the facts and chosen to defend the prejudice that came before them. Officer Holloway, Malcolm said, what evidence would you accept? Holloway opened his mouth, but nothing came. Malcolm continued, his voice low and precise. My federal identification was not enough. My keycard was not enough. The clerk's confirmation was not enough. The court seal is not enough. Tell this room what would be enough. Holloway glanced toward the empty bench. Someone with actual authority. Amanda looked at the clock above the rear doors. 9:53. 7 minutes remained before the scheduled session. Chief Deputy United States Marshal Robert King is already on his way to this courtroom, she said. He will verify Judge Hayes's identity. Several people in the gallery turned toward Malcolm. The title had now been stated clearly, without interruption and without ambiguity. Holloway stared at Amanda, then at Malcolm, but pride still fought against the truth visible in front of him. You are all protecting him, he said. Charles answered from beside the gallery rail. No, officer. We are protecting the facts. Holloway pointed toward Charles. Sit down before I remove you. Daniel stepped farther into the aisle. You have no lawful reason to remove a witness for speaking respectfully. Amanda placed both hands on the clerk's desk. Every instruction you give from this moment forward is being entered into the official log. Holloway looked toward the court reporter, then toward the camera above the doors. For the first time that morning, he seemed to understand that his words were no longer disappearing into a private hallway or an incomplete report. They were being preserved. Malcolm rose slowly from the chair. He did not move toward Holloway. He did not raise his voice. You asked for someone with authority, he said. But authority has been present from the beginning. What you have refused is accountability. Before Holloway could respond, the side door beside the judicial bench opened. Measured footsteps crossed the threshold, and Chief Deputy United States Marshal Robert King entered Courtroom 4 with 2 deputies behind him. His eyes moved across the room, stopped on Malcolm standing near the defense table, and immediately sharpened with concern. Judge Hayes, he said, why are you standing there? Robert King's question changed the room instantly. Holloway turned toward him, then back toward Malcolm, as though the title might somehow disappear if he refused to accept it. Chief Deputy King, he began, I was responding to a possible security breach involving questionable identification. King looked at the working access reader near the chamber's door, then at Amanda Lewis, then at the official court log open on her desk. A breach involving the judge assigned to this courtroom. Holloway's voice lost some of its firmness. I had concerns about the credentials. Amanda answered before he could reshape the story. The credentials were valid. The chamber's key card worked. I confirmed Judge Hayes's identity more than once. Daniel Mercer stepped forward. Officer Holloway also refused to follow the verification procedure and directed Judge Hayes to the defense section. Charles Whitaker remained standing near the gallery rail. He was told the truth several times. King's expression hardened, but his voice remained controlled. Officer Holloway, did you contact the United States Marshals Service to verify Judge Hayes's identity? Holloway hesitated. I made a radio report. That was not the question. The silence exposed the answer before Holloway gave it. No, he said. King looked toward the camera above the rear doors. Amanda, are the hallway and courtroom systems recording? Yes. King instructed one deputy to preserve the video, radio traffic, electronic access history, and every security log from the previous 20 minutes. The second deputy moved toward the clerk's desk to document the names of witnesses. Holloway watched each instruction with growing unease. The version of events he had tried to create was now surrounded by facts he could not control. King turned back to him, moved to the rear wall, and remained there until further instruction. Holloway obeyed. It was the first direct order he had followed without argument. Malcolm picked up his leather briefcase and walked toward the side entrance leading to chambers. No one spoke as he passed. The same room that had watched him, directed toward the defense tables, now watched him cross toward the bench with quiet dignity. Amanda disappeared through the chamber's door and returned carrying a neatly pressed black judicial robe. Malcolm removed his rain-marked overcoat and accepted the robe from her. The robe did not create his authority. It only made visible what Holloway had refused to recognize. Malcolm entered chambers while King took his position beside the bench. Amanda looked across the courtroom. All rise. Chairs moved at once. Attorneys stood. Reporters stood. Charles pushed himself upright with his cane. Daniel rose beside the aisle. Holloway stood near the rear wall, his face pale beneath the courtroom lights. The side door opened again. The United States District Court for the District of Maryland is now in session, Amanda announced. The Honorable Judge Malcolm Hayes presiding. Malcolm entered wearing the black robe and walked toward the bench beneath the federal seal. Every eye followed him. He took his seat, placed the confidential file before him, and looked directly at Holloway. Be seated. The courtroom sat as one. Holloway remained standing, uncertain whether he was permitted to move. Malcolm allowed the silence to settle. Officer Holloway, he said, a misunderstanding ends when the truth is offered. You were given identification, electronic access, confirmation from the clerk, and the court's own seal. You rejected every one of them. Holloway swallowed. Your Honor, I can explain. Malcolm held his gaze. You will have that opportunity. So will every person who witnessed what happened. Holloway remained near the rear wall while the courtroom settled around him. The black robe on Malcolm's shoulders did not make him more deserving of respect than he had been in the hallway, but it changed the way Holloway looked at him. Everyone noticed. Malcolm opened the confidential file, but kept the pages face down. Before the scheduled matter proceeds, this court must preserve an accurate record of what occurred this morning. He turned toward Robert King. Chief Deputy, confirm the status of the evidence. King answered from beside the bench. The hallway footage, courtroom footage, radio transmission, access history, and security log are being secured. The original files will remain unchanged. Malcolm nodded, then looked toward Amanda. Enter the names of every witness who observed the exchange. Amanda opened the official log. Daniel Mercer gave his full name and contact information. Charles Whitaker did the same. The court reporter identified herself, followed by two attorneys and several members of the public who had been standing near the chamber's entrance. One by one, people who had watched in silence became part of a record that could not be dismissed as confusion. Holloway looked around the room as though searching for someone willing to support his version of events. He found no one. Your Honor, he said, I made a judgment call based on security concerns. Malcolm's voice remained even. A judgment call requires facts. You rejected the facts that were offered. Holloway looked toward King. I believe the building might be at risk. King replied without hesitation. Then you should have followed the verification process. You did not. Malcolm rested one hand on the unopened file. There is another issue that must be addressed carefully. Pen stopped moving. The courtroom waited. Officer Holloway, your name appears in materials scheduled for confidential judicial review today. Holloway's face changed. Those old complaints were closed. Malcolm did not open the file. I will not discuss their contents from this bench. However, the conduct recorded this morning may overlap with issues already under review. Holloway swallowed. I did not know that. You did not need to know, Malcolm said. Your conduct should not depend on whether someone is examining your past. The words settled across the room with quiet precision. Holloway had expected the reveal of Malcolm's identity to end the story. Instead, it had opened a deeper question. This was no longer only about one black man being judged by appearance. It was about how many others had faced the same certainty without a courtroom full of witnesses. Malcolm turned toward Amanda. Because I am now a direct witness to conduct that may relate to those materials, I cannot preside over the scheduled matter. Holloway looked up, visibly surprised. Malcolm continued. I will recuse myself. The case will be reassigned to an independent federal judge, and the evidence from this morning will be transferred without interpretation from me. Daniel lowered his pen. Charles gave a slow nod. The difference between the two men had become impossible to miss. Holloway had used authority to resist scrutiny. Malcolm was limiting his own authority to protect fairness. King stepped toward Holloway. Pending independent review, surrender your courthouse, credential, and radio. Holloway stared at him. Chief Deputy, is that necessary? Yes. The courtroom waited. Slowly, Holloway removed the credential from his uniform and placed it into King's open hand. Then he handed over the radio that had carried his incomplete report through the building. Malcolm watched without satisfaction. Officer Holloway, he said, your greatest mistake was not failing to recognize a judge. It was believing respect should depend on recognizing one. Holloway lowered his eyes. Malcolm looked toward the families seated in the gallery. The law cannot protect only those who arrive with titles, robes, or witnesses, he said. If it does, it is not justice. It is privilege wearing the language of justice. The credential rested in Robert King's hand while the courtroom absorbed Malcolm's words. No one applauded. No one smiled. The moment did not feel like victory because what had been exposed was too serious to celebrate. Holloway had not simply made one poor decision under pressure. He had shown how easily authority could become prejudice when no one demanded accountability. Malcolm looked toward Assistant United States Attorney Claire Dawson, who had entered quietly during the final exchange and now stood near the government table with a blue file box at her side. She had been scheduled to present preliminary material for the confidential review, but Malcolm's recusal changed what could happen next. Ms. Dawson, he said, do not discuss the substance of the sealed matter before me. Confirm only whether additional requests for independent review have been received. Claire placed one hand on the file box. Yes, Your Honor. Multiple former complainants have renewed their requests, and several others contacted our office after receiving notice of today's proceeding. Holloway raised his eyes. How many? Claire looked toward the reassignment notice Amanda was preparing. 10 known requests at this time. The number settled over the room with quiet force. 10 people who had once been treated as isolated voices. 10 accounts that had been reduced to uncertainty, misunderstanding, or insufficient evidence. Holloway had relied on each person standing alone. Now their experiences were beginning to form a pattern. Malcolm turned toward King. Transfer the preserved recordings, radio traffic, and access history directly to the independent investigator. The original files must remain unchanged. Understood, King replied. Malcolm then addressed Amanda. Notify the chief judge that immediate reassignment is required. Include my written recusal and the factual sequence entered into the log. Nothing more. Amanda nodded and began typing. Every instruction was careful. Every boundary mattered. Malcolm would not allow anger to enter the process, even when anger would have been understandable. Holloway looked toward the bench. Judge Hayes, I did not know those complaints were connected to today's review. Malcolm held his gaze. You did not need to know. Holloway seemed confused. Malcolm continued. Fair treatment is not something you provide only when you believe consequences are watching. Claire opened the blue file box, but did not remove any documents. The renewed request describes similar concerns, she said. Failure to verify identification, incomplete reporting, and assumptions about who belonged in a particular place. Holloway shook his head. Those are allegations. Yes, Claire answered. and now they will be examined alongside evidence. Daniel Mercer returned to the counsel table, but kept his notes open. Charles Whitaker slowly lowered himself into his seat. The court reporter continued recording every word. Around them, the building resumed its ordinary rhythm, yet Courtroom 4 remained fixed inside a moment that would follow everyone beyond that morning. Malcolm removed his glasses and folded them beside the confidential file. "This court will not decide your future today, Officer Holloway," he said. "An independent process will do that. But every person who came forward will finally be heard." King directed one deputy to accompany Holloway from the courtroom while the administrative review began. Holloway took a step, then stopped. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "are you doing all of this because of what happened to you?" Malcolm looked toward the families seated beneath the federal seal, each holding documents that represented months or years of being dismissed. "No," he answered. "What happened to me was witnessed, recorded, and believed. They deserve the same." Holloway lowered his head and continued toward the rear doors. As they closed behind him, Malcolm looked at the empty place where the credential had once rested against Holloway's uniform. The badge had not created the prejudice. It had only given that prejudice room to act. Now the truth occupied the same room, and truth did not need permission to remain. 4 months later, Courtroom 4 looked almost unchanged, but the people inside carried a different understanding of what the room was supposed to protect. The federal seal still hung above the bench. The same rows of wooden seats faced forward beneath the bright lights. Yet Malcolm Hayes did not enter through the chamber's door. He walked through the public entrance wearing a dark suit and took a seat in the second row beside Amanda Lewis, Daniel Mercer, Charles Whitaker, and several families whose complaints had once been closed without full review. He was not there as the presiding judge. He was there as a witness to a process that no longer depended on his title. During the months that followed the incident, independent investigators examined the courthouse recordings, radio transmissions, access records, prior reports, and statements from more than a dozen people. 3 official findings were revised after omitted evidence came to light. 2 pending cases connected to Holloway's earlier service with the Baltimore Police Department were dismissed because reviewers found serious procedural failures. His courthouse clearance had been permanently revoked by the appropriate security authority, and his employer had accepted his resignation from federal court security service. More important, every complaint connected to his conduct was now being reviewed outside the chain of command that had once dismissed it. Claire Dawson stood at the government table with the final summary before her. Robert King remained near the side wall, his attention fixed on the courtroom with the quiet responsibility of a man determined not to let procedure fail again. Then the rear doors opened. Grant Holloway entered without a uniform, without a radio, and without the credential that had once made him believe his judgment could not be challenged. He wore a plain gray suit and walked beside his attorney toward the front table. His eyes moved toward the bench first, then toward Malcolm in the gallery. For a moment, the 2 men looked at each other across the room. Malcolm did not smile. There was no triumph in his expression. He had not come to watch Holloway lose something. He had come to see whether the people Holloway had ignored would finally be treated as credible. Amanda rose at the clerk's desk. "All rise." Every person in the courtroom stood. Malcolm stood with them. Charles pushed himself upright with his cane. The families stood beside folders containing names that had once existed only in forgotten files. Holloway stood as well, but now the command did not come from him. It came from an institution that demanded equal respect and owed equal protection in return. The newly assigned federal judge entered and took the bench. After reviewing the independent findings, she acknowledged that Holloway's courthouse clearance had been permanently revoked and referred the remaining matters to the appropriate state authorities and licensing bodies. She also ordered continuing review of every case in which his conduct had been formally questioned. The decision did not erase the past. It created a path for the truth to keep moving. When the proceeding ended, people slowly gathered their belongings. Holloway remained near the aisle while Malcolm rose from the gallery. His attorney stood only a few feet away as Holloway spoke. "Judge Hayes, I judged you before I knew who you were." Malcolm stopped and held his gaze. "You knew enough to treat me like a human being." Holloway lowered his eyes. There was no argument left, no uniform to hide behind, and no incomplete report capable of silencing the record. Malcolm turned and walked toward the doors with the families beside him. Behind them, Courtroom 4 remained quiet beneath the federal seal. Holloway had once believed power meant deciding where other people belonged. In the end, the law taught him that dignity has no assigned seat, and justice begins when authority remembers its limits.